technical difficulties, but we are here.
Praise God.
So I would like to introduce just a short and simple introduction. Dr. Kevin Burton, he's coming from the ICE, not the federal department, okay? From the ice and cold weather of Michigan, where we have, one of our universities there, Andrews University. He's the director of the Center of Adventist Research, and he will explain you more about what this department does in our church. And we welcome Dr. Kevin, okay?
Okay. Hi, Burton. It's good to see you. Happy Sabbath to you. So, I come from Andrews University and got in today. Happy to be with you. The Center for Adventist Research it's primarily an archive. Have any of you ever spent time in an archive before? Yeah, okay, so this is where we keep a lot of the rare, even a lot of the one-of-a-kind documents of our heritage. And it's probably, I think it's arguably the oldest archive we have in the church. The General Conference was saving a lot of things, but then they ended up giving them to what is now the Center for Adventist Research because the seminary is at Andrews University. And this is where a lot of graduate students will use this material to write books, articles, etc. And so how many of you have ever read a book on Adventist history? Okay, a few of you. Pretty much guarantee you that probably almost every book out there on Adventist history, they use at least some, if not many, documents to write that book. And so, all of George Knight's books were written from the archive there. Light Bearers to the Remnant, that old classic, all of that's written from there. And so we do our very best to collect everything by, about, against, and related to all versions of Adventism from around the world. And so that's a bit what we do. We have the Adventist Digital Library, which is an online archive, and you can look at some of the stuff that's digitized there, and you can use that. So anyhow, I'm a historian. That's what I do. And so I study American religious history and then specifically Adventism within that sort of context. And so this presentation will be the first of 3 that I'm doing and sharing with you guys this weekend. And this is where we're going to set some of the stage for what will come. And so you guys are going to have more knowledge than what those who are not here will have tomorrow. But let me give you a little bit more about how I think first. Is that okay? Okay. So I'm very practical. I like to think about what people do. I like to know how people act and behave, in history. Some historians will like to study how people think, okay? I think that's important too. I really like to study how people, like what they do. I want to know what kinds of things they're doing, and I think that interests me a lot. And so you might call that a lived theology. I like to study how people live their faith. And so a lot of what we're going to be sharing today, and through the whole time we're here, is about how Adventists in the past have actively engaged and lived out their faith. And from my perspective, this is where the money meets the road. Like, this is where the rubber meets the road, because if we claim that we believe in Jesus and we have a relationship with Jesus, but that doesn't change our lives and how we treat other people, what's the point? What's the point? You can be the best Adventist out there. You can believe all the 28 fundamental beliefs. You can be the most extreme vegan. You can do all these things. But if you don't actually live a good Christian life and care for the least of these and help other people around you, I think you're missing the whole point. So anyways, we're going to talk about a lot of our history this evening, okay? And I want to share some things about our past that you probably don't know unless maybe you've seen a presentation I've done online before, or maybe someone who has seen it has shared some aspects of this before. But a lot of this that I share with you tonight has come from my dissertation research and a book that I am publishing this year. And so it's new information. This is stuff that has not been in books before. This is original research. So I hope you like it. It says a lot about who we are. And as we get into it, I want us to think about this passage from Scripture, Proverbs 31, 8, and 9. And it says this: "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy." And something that I strongly believe is clear in Scripture is that if we are silent in the face of injustice, we're actually committing a sin. If we let some sort of evil just continue on without doing whatever we can to stop that, like Christ teaches us to do, I think that we're actually committing a sin. And I think we see that kind of clearly in James 4:17, where it says, "If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." And so this is something that I think is worth reflecting on, especially considering the world we live in today. There's a lot of issues in this country that have come to the surface in recent years, and we're in a time where we need to stand up like the Adventists did in the early days, when there was slavery. And not just slavery, but something that I'm going to introduce you to called Jim Crow. But before we do that, I know that you all know about slavery at some level, okay? Just a few basic facts to help you understand what's going on. Slavery was a growing enterprise that was driving not just the U.S. economy, but the world economy. It was getting bigger. It was getting worse. It was getting more harsh. The conditions for slaves were worsening as the years marched closer to what would become the American Civil War. Over the entire history of slavery in America, from 1619 to the Civil War, you had about 10 million slaves in total. And 1860 alone, there were 4 million living at one time. So that shows you how it's growing. And there's a graph here showing by the censuses, it's showing you how slavery is spreading from 1790 now to 1800, 1810, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a fascinating statistic that historians have come up with that was published in 2022, I think it was, in a journal called Slavery and Abolition. And that is, if you combine or you add up all of the free labor that slaves gave throughout the entire hundreds of years that they were there, all 10 million of them, it equates to about 410 billion hours of free labor. Now, that's an impossible number, I think, for our minds to comprehend, because if you put that into just something like years that we can kind of get, you're still like into the hundreds of millions of years. Like it's a vast number. 410 billion hours is a huge number. And so we should pause, I think, and think about that, because this country was literally built upon the backs of slaves. And that's something that we should never take for granted, because every one of us is benefiting from that now. Was it right? Absolutely not. It was horrible. It was atrocious. Every single one of God's laws was being violated through that horrible system. It was extremely oppressive. It's not just slavery, though. Adventism is not born in the regions where slavery exists. Adventism is born in the northern states. That's where Adventism began and arose and spread. And it didn't really go to the south because the Adventists were opposed to slavery. And so, but what's going on in the north? Have you heard of the phrase Jim Crow before? Okay, Jim Crow refers to racial segregation. And we usually think about it in reference to the South after the Civil War. That's when it's talked about in the history books. That's when people think, that's what the initial thought that comes to people's minds. But Jim Crow segregation, racial segregation, was a northern invention. And here's how it worked. Whenever slavery is gradually abolished in the northern states, white people were so racist at the time that they did not want black people to think that they could be equals with whites. And so they came up with Jim Crow segregation laws and practices to make sure that black people stayed subjugated to the white person, the white man specifically. Women didn't have rights either back then. And that is the context in which our church was born. What does that mean practically? I've got a quote up on the screen, but I'll just give you some details. It means that if you were African American, there were only 4 states that you could vote in, okay? That's the upper New England states: New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and Massachusetts. okay? If you lived anywhere else, you either couldn't vote at all, or in New York, you could vote if you owned $300 worth of property, okay? White men didn't have to own a certain amount of property, just black men. But there's another problem there. Voting was public at the time. It wasn't until the 1870s that voting became a private act. And so whenever you voted, you went to a particular polling station with a particular colored ballot, and everyone knew if you were voting and who you were voting for. And so there were people, they would police the polling stations, and they would prevent black people from voting. So black people virtually didn't vote even in those upper New England states. And those who tried sometimes were physically assaulted. Okay? Transportation was segregated everywhere. Trains, they're segregated. Stagecoaches are segregated. Ships, all this kind of stuff is segregated. Hotels are segregated. Churches are segregated. If you're black, you have to sit in a distant back pew or in a balcony, okay? And they called them the Jim Crow pews. They called them the Jim Crow cars, the Jim Crow train cars, if you're riding there. So there's virtually no rights whatsoever. Black people don't have any kind of citizenship. Birthright citizenship doesn't exist yet. 14th Amendment hasn't been established yet. And so they're not considered citizens, and they have no rights, okay? And so this is the context in which Adventism is born, and several people like Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave and then becomes an abolitionist in the North after he runs away and earns his own freedom that way. Several people like this who knew what slavery was like and then who also lived in the North, they actually said it was worse in the North than in the South. They said that racism was worse there than in the South. And part of the reason for that is because black people were so scarce in the North that white people in the North had hardly ever even seen someone who was black. It was just very strange for them. And so these kinds of things are just prevalent. And it's important to know that context if you want to understand and appreciate Adventism when Adventism started, when our denomination begins, okay? And so let's go through some of that. Another thing before we do that, though, a little bit more context. You would think, right, that maybe Christians would be different? That maybe Christians would be on the right side of things? Would you think that if I asked you about that today? Some things don't change a whole lot. And tragically, most Christians, almost all of them, were very much on the pro-slavery side of things. They were absolutely against abolition. And, in the North, this is true as well. And they would actually say, don't get involved with slavery. That's just something we should stay silent on. We need to focus on the mission of the church, which is saving souls. And they said, don't get involved with that. Abolitionism is destroying the church. Stay out of politics. And they would say things like that, okay? Those things are very much with us today. Those same ideas. Have you heard about staying silent now? Have you been told that you need to not get involved in politics and all this kind of stuff? Now, I'm going to give a caveat here. I think it's very true, and our pioneers were very strong about not engaging in partisan politics to the point where you're so loyal to a party that it's jeopardizing your faith. That's a real issue. So when I'm talking about politics, I'm not talking about parties. I'm talking about issues. Whether we like it or not, politics and religion are so intertwined, you really can't avoid this stuff. All kinds of religious issues and moral issues are intertwined with all the issues in politics. It's just because that's the way life is. Okay, and so I'm using politics in that general broad sense, but they were too. And they were saying you can't get involved with this slavery issue because you got to stay out of politics. And so they were encouraging silence. This is what almost all Christians, all evangelical Christians, all Protestants are telling you. It wasn't until the middle of the Civil War that the major denominations in the North, the Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, people like that, it wasn't until the middle of the Civil War that they actually finally said that slavery was a sin. Can you imagine that? They would not admit that slavery was a sin. A sin. Not until the middle of the Civil War. And so the number one objective of the abolitionists was to just try to convince people that this is actually a sin. And it's violating all the commands of God. But the abolitionists also cared a lot about making sure that slavery ended as soon as possible. and they cared about equal rights for black people in America. So they were advocating for those two things. But they were having to work against the entire nation. Even as anti-slavery sentiments rise in America, at the eve of the Civil War, only about 1, maybe 2% of the northern population was actually an abolitionist. So we're talking about a tiny, tiny fraction. And our church is part of that 1%, because we began as an abolitionist church. And I want to share with you some of the ways that our pioneers broke the silence. Because no matter what you might think about Adventists and their approach to anti-slavery, one thing is undeniably clear. They were not silent, and they spoke out repeatedly in a variety of ways against this injustice of their own era. And they fully engaged in all of this. So they did petitioning, for example. They petitioned on a wide variety of subjects that related to slavery in some way. The petition I'm showing you here, this is from the National Archives. I found this several years ago. And this is signed by Joseph Bates, who is pictured there, and his wife Prudence. Joseph Bates, of course, as you know, is one of the founders of our denomination. And here he's signing petitions against capital punishment. He's wanting the death penalty to be abolished. Part of the reason is because he knows that black people were targeted more by the law enforcement officers of the time, much like they are today. Racial profiling happens back then like it does now. And Joseph Bates is wanting this kind of stuff to stop. And so he is signing petitions like this. He's an Adventist, a Seventh-day Adventist, while he does this, right? He's actually founding our church as he's doing this kind of thing. And there's other kinds of petitions that are out there too. This is one of my favorite. This shows how Adventists cared about international issues. And so they were advocating that the United States recognize the independence of Haiti as a nation. Haiti won its independence from France around the turn of the 19th century in a bloody slave revolt. And it was the only successful slave revolt in world history. And America refuses to recognize Haiti as an independent country for 60 years. 6 decades go by. France, by the way, recognized Haiti as an independent nation 3 decades earlier. But America wouldn't do it. Why wouldn't they do it? They wouldn't do it because almost all white people in the country believed that black people were incapable of governing themselves. And they had science to back that up. They had religion and the Bible to back that up, and all this kind of stuff. And if you recognized Haiti as an independent nation, as a nation run by black people who won their independence from white people, that just wouldn't fly. And so it wasn't until Lincoln took office that this finally happens in 1862. But Adventist pioneers are signing these petitions long before that. And you have here pictured, this is Stockbridge and Louisa Howland. These are important pioneers. Maybe you haven't heard of them, but they were really close friends with James and Ellen White. And there were so many crucial meetings held at their home in the 1850s and 60s and even the 1840s that their home was known as Fort Howland in Adventist circles. Did you know that James and Ellen White traveled a lot when they had young children preaching, and they didn't take their kids with them? They couldn't. So guess what? They left them with the Howlands, and the Howlands raised their boys. Yep. In fact, you even see Henry, the oldest child, who's captured in the 1850 census, living in their home and listed as if he's one of their children. It is also, by the way, where Henry died in 1863. He dies in their home. They were like his second parents. So these are really crucial people and central to our beginnings, right? These are not just random people. You had Adventists that were advocating that black people have the right to vote. And so one of the people that I'm mentioning here is Ezra A. Poole. You see his tombstone there. We don't have a picture of him. Ezra A. Poole was a Seventh-day Adventist minister in the early years, 1850s. He lived in upstate New York, and he was a strong abolitionist. He, in fact, had been involved in a early revolt, you could call it, before he joins the Adventists. In the 1830s, there was a bunch of students at the Lane Theological Seminary in Ohio. And all the professors there forbid these seminarians from discussing, even just discussing and debating the issue of slavery. They wouldn't even let them talk about it. And so Theodore Dwight Weld and the so-called Lane rebels They revolt against the administration of the Lane Seminary, and they just leave, a mass exodus of about 30 or 40 of them. And most of them go on down to Oberlin College and help get Oberlin College started, which was a abolitionist school and one of the first schools, the second school, in fact, that allowed women and men to study together, a coeducational school. So that's who Ezra A. Poole was. And so these are people that are just there and central to the beginnings of our church. Another petition or petitions, a group of petitions that pioneers of our church would sign, were to abolish the interracial marriage ban. Now that's one of the more radical ones as well. And what happens here in this case is that in 1839, a bunch of women, mostly white abolitionist women, circulated and signed petitions to legalize interracial marriage. And the way that the North and the South responded was through slanderous propaganda. And so they started to circulate, I think I probably have it here, they started to circulate images like this to suggest that all of these white women were doing this because they wanted to have sex with black men. And so you have this so-called amalgamation waltz, where they have black men with exaggerated racialized features, etc., very racist depictions, dancing with these white women, and the implicit underlying thing is that this is all about sex. And so this is how they responded. And so abolitionist men rose up to not only support their wives' cause, but to defend their wives' honor. And so in 1840, the men started to circulate these petitions as well. Women did, by the way, out-petition men. And I guess I don't have it for you here. But Joseph Bates is not just signing these petitions. Joseph Bates will circulate them. And he's the one that's going around and gathering all the signatures there for these petitions, all the different various kinds of them, whether it's abolishing interracial marriage bans or getting rid of racial segregation on transportation or to recognize the independence of Haiti or, et cetera. Bates does all of them. Bates is involved in all of these things. Adventists also, many of them at least, they were also involved in voting in political parties that were abolitionist. You've probably never heard of the Liberty Party. Has anybody ever heard of the Liberty Party? Okay, there's a couple people who have. The Liberty Party was a pure abolitionist party. They only had two things on their political platform. Number one, they wanted the immediate emancipation of all slaves. And number two, they wanted equal rights for black people in America. Okay? That's it. They didn't have any other kinds of things on their agenda. And so it's a very unique party. The people in the party would say that the Bible is our textbook, and so it was very much tied with religion. They would say that you need to vote as you pray and pray as you vote. And so this was a huge thing for them. Okay, and it doesn't last long. It rises up in 1840, and by 1848, it's basically gone. Okay, but during those 8 years, Millerite Adventists are heavily involved in this, and they probably comprise between 10 and maybe 25% of the entire party's strength. Every single level of the party's leadership had Adventist leaders in it, including the founders of the party and the intellectual thought leaders of the party. Okay, and so at every sort of level, they're there, and they are voting and engaging in these kinds of protests to get slavery abolished. And what happens with the Liberty Party, the real major success of the Liberty Party, is that in 1848, the Free Soil Party sort of takes over. And the Free Soil Party is not an anti-slavery party. It's only opposing the extension of slavery. Okay? So it's not a purely abolitionist party, but they're exposing the extension of slavery. And that party will last for a few more years, and then in 1854, the Republican Party rises up from that, and the Free Soil Party sort of seeds the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, as you know, was the party that eventually, by 1860, elects Abraham Lincoln, leads to the Civil War, and the actual downfall of race-based chattel slavery in America. So that all begins with the Liberty Party, okay? But the problem is that the Liberty Party and those folks, they wanted it to be a pure abolitionist party. They wanted the immediate abolition of slavery everywhere and equal rights for black people. But most white people in America wouldn't go that far. They wouldn't do that. So they had to broaden it out and to make it about just stopping the spread of slavery so that it doesn't go out west, it doesn't come up north, that kind of thing. And when they broadened it in that way, they got enough buy-in from people to eventually elect Lincoln. But it wasn't ever about trying to actually take care of the rights of black people. But you see that there were hundreds, actually, maybe even thousands of Millerites who believed that Jesus Christ was coming in 1843 or 1844. And yet they're running for office as candidates for the Liberty Party. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't that seem counterintuitive? It wasn't for them. And you know why? It's because of Adventism that they were doing this kind of stuff. It's because of their faith that they were doing this kind of stuff. They said, and they believed fervently, that if you really believe that Jesus is coming soon, then show it by your actions. If you really believe that God is going to take you to an egalitarian paradise where there will be no color line in heaven, and they did teach that. Most people said that heaven would be racially segregated, okay? But the abolitionists, they said not at all, and they questioned whether or not slave owners would even make it, okay? And so they're saying, if you want to be there, then live it as fully now as you can. Live it as fully now as you can. And so this transformed the entire way that Millerites worshipped. And I can't remember if I go into detail in this presentation or not, but I will say more about that in a bit. This is just showing you some other people that are involved. It's a little hard to see for you probably, but it just shows that there are other people involved in this party. Like, for example, over here, the Granite Freeman is an anti-slavery newspaper from New Hampshire. And notice the date, October 17, 1844. And there are two Millerite ministers, Peter Clark and Noah Piper. Maybe you can't see their names, but they're actually running for presidential electors for the Liberty Party. That's an extremely high office. You really only get higher than that by having the president and the vice presidential candidates, because those are the people that are actually going to have the power to put them in office, like we even have with electors today, right? So these are people that were trusted. The entire Liberty Party trusted Millerite Adventists to be faithful in the anti-slavery cause, and you can see that demonstrated in so many different ways. We'll keep moving on. I think I'll skip this for now. This is just showing how there's some more influence there. There's also the Millerites and early Seventh-day Adventists. They also were involved in boycotts and other kinds of protests like civil disobedience. Okay? And this is a very fascinating thing. So there were some, this was the smallest sector of the abolitionist movement because it was the hardest to practice, but they tried to boycott slave labor products. Okay? And so things that were made of cotton, grown by slaves in the South. This also affects sugar a lot, because most of the sugar that Americans used was picked by slaves in the South. And so those are the main two things. There were some other things, but they tried to boycott those. And this is especially common with abolitionist grocers, people that had grocery stores and so forth. Like this guy here, Elias Leonard Platt. You can see there's an advertisement for the free labor sugar and molasses that he sold at his store in upstate New York, in Bath, New York. He was a black Seventh-day Adventist. He was a black Millerite and then became a Seventh-day Adventist. This is not his picture here. We don't have a picture of him, but that's his son, William K. Platt. But yeah, this is something that he would do. And there were some other Seventh-day Adventists. John W. West, another black Seventh-day Adventist. He was also one of our first black Adventist ministers. He also ran a free labor, free produce grocery store in Peterborough, New York. And then there were several Millerites involved in this as well. And of course, beyond grocers, others who are actually trying to make sure they buy those products. This is still an issue for us today. I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but how many of you like chocolate, for example? Right? I like chocolate. I love chocolate. Did you know that most chocolate today is grown in Western Africa, and it is picked by child slaves from the ages of 5 to 16? And all of the major chocolate companies out there use slave chocolate. Nestle, Hershey's, all of that, you name it. The only ones that don't do it, and I can share with you if you want to know a list of anti-slavery chocolate companies, I can share that with you if you want to do this. But they're not companies you typically know of or heard of. The hardest way to avoid slave chocolate is in ice cream, I think. The only slave-free chocolate that is in ice cream that I know of is Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's is the only company that I know of that doesn't use slave chocolate. So this is still an issue. It's very hard to avoid, because go beyond that, our clothing, sweatshops, etc., all this kind of stuff. How can you avoid it if you if you shop at Walmart, if you shop at Target, if you shop on Amazon? We're all supporting that system. And it's hard not to unless you're wealthy enough to avoid doing that. So it's very challenging. It was the same for the abolitionists. But nevertheless, some of our pioneers did engage in that kind of protest. This is Joseph Bates here. I mentioned that he would sign petitions that were opposing racial segregation. And so he is involved in that. Here's one of his petitions there. But there's other people as well. There's some black Adventists, black Millerite Adventists, who were actually the ones that were assaulted on the trains. Okay, and so Richard Johnson, for example, he was not assaulted, but he's wanting to go to a Millerite camp meeting with his daughter and a whole group of other black Millerites. And he buys a first-class ticket, gets on the train, and he's immediately told that he's got to leave because black people are not allowed to be in this car. And he's like, well, I paid for this passage, I paid for this ticket, and they absolutely refuse to let him on. And so he refuses to go to the so-called Negro car, the so-called Jim Crow car. And so he ends up paying for a stagecoach at a much higher fee to go to the Millerite camp meeting. He could do that because he was probably the wealthiest black man in America at the time. Most other people could not. And so the man you see pictured there, that's Jabez Campbell. He did the same thing. He purchased a first-class fare on the train, and he was riding in one state. It was allowed, and he was fine. He was riding, but then the train crosses the border into a new state. New conductors get on there, and they demand that he leaves. And he said, I paid for this ticket, I'm not going to do it. And so they bring in 4 or 5 other ruffians or whatever, and they beat him within an inch of his life. And he almost died over that. Other abolitionists would see that kind of thing happen. And white abolitionists would gather around and try to protect black people who were doing this. And they would stage what we might call ride-ins, where they would intentionally go to the first-class car to try to cause an uproar, et cetera, to raise public awareness of what's going on and get the issue to be eradicated, right? And so Hugh B. Luge is a white Millerite who is involved with this. He gets connected with a non-Adventist dentist named Daniel Mann, another white man, and they're going to the train station, and they hear about a black man who gets on the white-only car. And so immediately they rush and they surround him, and there's a group of 5 or 6 abolitionists, white abolitionists, that surround this guy. And then the conductors come on and they say, get that man off this train. And they say, why? He's not bothering us. And they get the whole car to say, we want him to stay. And they said, not going to happen. And so they forcibly remove Ebenezer Jackson, the black man who was trying to ride the train. And then they come back and they said, I want to get all of those blank abolitionists off this train. And they violently eject them. I think Daniel Mann broke his thumb, got broken, etc. And here's the lesson in this. That case was important because Daniel Mann sued. He sued over this. He lost. Now, you would see, what's the impact there? It had impact. Because of the fact that Daniel Mann sued and loses, and that there's a media campaign that is launched, Daniel Mann and the abolitionists were able to convince white Northerners that their own rights were being violated because they wanted to sit there on that train and they were being evicted simply because they were wanting to sit next to a black person. And that has been a key to success when it comes to racial justice in America. That's tragic. Think about what democracy is. Democracy is based upon the principle of majority rule. Okay? Not a bad principle per se, but that means if you want change to happen, you have to have the majority support it. Okay? So what does that mean for minorities? There is hope, but it's slim, right? Because you have to somehow, as minorities, convince the majority that this is important for them too. And so the way that time after time again we've gotten justice for minorities in this country is by showing the white majority, this is a violation of your rights too. So we got to change it. It's good because you get the change, but you don't get it for the right reason. So the Jim Crow segregation practices were largely abolished in 1843. Bates and others are involved in actually getting that overturned. And Daniel Mann and Hugh B. Luge and other people, they actually get the train companies to stop that practice, by and large. But it was not done for the right reason. It's not because people in the North are like, oh yeah, we got to, treat people fairly. No, that just wasn't the case, sadly. So anyhow, regardless, this is something that we were involved in as, like our pioneers were involved in as a church, which is fascinating to think about. Now, the civil disobedience thing, maybe you've heard about this before. Has anybody heard that Ellen White told Adventists that they need to disobey the fugitive slave law? Does anybody know what the fugitive slave law was? Okay. In 1850, well, in the 1700s, 1793, there was a fugitive slave law passed, okay? But it wasn't that effective. There were ways that northern states could get around it, and so in 1850, they revised that fugitive slave law, and they gave it a lot of teeth. What that meant is they said, you are now duty-bound to help officers recapture slaves whether you want to or not. If they say that you need to help them, you have to help them, or you will have to pay the consequences. If you were found harboring a fugitive slave, then you're going to be fined $1,000, that's about a year's wages, and spend 6 months in jail. It's going to cripple your family. That's going to disrupt everything about your life, right? But the Adventists disobeyed it, and Ellen White is encouraging them to do so. This is what she says. Let's read it. She says this, where the laws of men conflict with God's word and law, we are to obey the word and the law of God, whatever the consequences may be. The laws of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey, and we must abide by the consequences of the violation of this law. Now, I want you to think real quick. Let it sink in what that means. This is a prophet of God telling you to break a federal law. Sign me up, right? Yeah, who's wanting to do that? No, this is serious. This is radical. This is radical. Now, I want you to know why she's saying that, okay? I want you to understand why she's saying this, because it shouldn't be missed. Have you seen this in Deuteronomy 23:15? How the fugitive slave law in America, the Adventist pioneer said this is a direct violation of the law of God. It says this in Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16. Thou shalt not deliver to his master the servant or slave which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place that he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. See, the Adventists called this God's fugitive slave law. And they recognized that if people had followed God's law, then slavery virtually can't exist. Because slaves don't want to be enslaved. And all they would have to do is run away. And then if they do that, they should have their freedom by God's law. And then slavery can't exist. So they recognized and they saw this as a huge way that the Bible was opposed to slavery. And so they said, we will not follow the federal law because it is a direct violation of the law of God. And so people call that the higher law principle. Whenever God's law is violated by some human law, which one do you choose? You got to go with God's law. But that is easier said than done. Okay, let's be real. We all admire, I think, people on the Underground Railroad for what they did and the courage it took, and yet it's difficult. But several Adventists did. John Byington, perhaps you know, there's a biography of John Byington written by Brian Strayer. There's a couple of pictures. These are hiding places for slaves that he built into buildings that still stand. Okay? They're in a couple churches and also a parish or two that he built for the pastor of that congregation. And John Byington is active in hiding slaves. Now, this is another related case that helps illustrate what we've just been sharing. And so in 1854, there was a black fugitive named Anthony Burns who had run away from Virginia and had been captured in Boston. And he is taken back down to slavery. The abolitionists do everything within their power to get this man free. They try to violently take him from the people who had captured him. They try to purchase his liberty. They try to sneak him away. They do literally everything they can. But the President of the United States refused to let anything be done because he wanted to prove to the South that the North will protect slavery. And so he goes back south. And as an interesting fun fact, when he was a child, when Anthony Burns was a child in Virginia on the slave plantations, he became a Millerite. Anthony Burns was a Millerite Adventist. And he writes about this in his biography later, in the 1850s. And so he may have remained an Adventist his whole life, like a first-day Sunday-keeping Adventist. I don't know. But nevertheless, he is being taken back to the South. It was an outrage to the abolitionists, especially in the North. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church is headquartered in Rochester, New York at the time. And one of our leaders there, Edwin R. Seaman, he writes this, and James White publishes it in the review. And he says this: "A man made in God's own image is torn from friends and society and all that is dear in life and dragged back into slavery by that power of that atrocious bargain, the fugitive slave law. All men are created free and equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And now he emphasizes this, not me. He says, if this nation would not be the most hypocritical nation on the face of the earth, it should amend this declaration thus: all white men, and he underscores the word white, all white men are created free and equal, etc. And here's something to really think about that I want you to think about of the pioneers. He continues and he says this: has not this two-horned, lamb-like beast corrupted the commandment as well as the Roman dragon? Now, I need to unpack that for you. He's referring to what we often call the lamb-like beast of Revelation 13 that arises up out of the earth. You remember that beast? Okay? That's the one that Adventists have connected and identified as America in prophecy. You heard this? You've heard this before? Okay, good. Now, how the Adventists originally taught that has changed. Because what they originally taught, and it's close to what we still teach, but different, I'll explain the difference, is this. They say that beast is described as lamb-like because it has two horns that are representing good things or good professions. And one of them is civil liberty. The other one is religious liberty. Those are good things, and America claims to give that to everybody. But the Adventists taught at the time that America is, not will later or eventually become, but is now, at this very moment, a dragon. In reality, it's a dragon. It is literally like a wolf in sheep's clothing, because we know that America claims to give civil liberties to everybody, but it denies civil liberties to racial minorities. And it claims to give religious liberty to everyone, but it denies religious liberty to religious minorities. And so they said, this is a beast now. And they recognized that dragon nature of this beast and how awful it was and how oppressed people were. And they spoke out vehemently for over a decade about it. They were angry. And the main thing that they talked about when they did was slavery. This was the main thing that proved that America was a dragon. They didn't talk about blue laws like a national Sunday law much. That wasn't part of the discussion. That doesn't really become a major thing until the 1880s, 1890s. And I want you to think about this again, knowing what I just shared with you. He says, has not this two-horned, lamb-like beast corrupted the commandment as well as the Roman dragon? You know about the Roman dragon. You know how the Roman dragon corrupts the commandments, right? You've heard that before, right? Changing times and laws, right? Specifically, Sabbath to Sunday, right? We know that. But they also thought that America was just as draconic and deadly because it's violating the commandments of God in the same exact way. It's not about time, though, in this case. It's about the freedom of people. Which commandment are they violating? I just shared it with you, right? God's fugitive slave law, Deuteronomy 23. And so because of the fact that America is violating the commandment of God, they viewed America as just as draconic or horrible or oppressive or whatever you want to call it as the papacy was during the Middle Ages and the Spanish Inquisition. They didn't mince their words at all. They were very radical. Okay? Let's see. We need to probably wrap it up. This is, well, you can tell me. I could keep us here for hours, but maybe we can. Okay. Yeah, I think we had talked about half an hour. I don't know when we're supposed to end here. 10 o'clock. That'll be like 1 a.m. for me in Michigan time. Can I share a couple more things with you then? Okay. Because this is the religious protests get to be extremely exciting to me because you see how they do stuff together. Okay, and so there is a song that the Millerites loved, and maybe you've heard of it. I'll sing a little bit for you. Just don't record my voice because I'm not a singer. But have you ever heard the song, "You will see the Lord a-comin', you will see the Lord a-comin', you will see the Lord a-comin' in a few more days"? You heard that song before? Okay, some of you have, well, at least one or two people have. Okay, you will see the Lord a-comin', you will see the Lord a-comin', you will see the Lord a-comin' in a few more days. How does it go after that? I'm dropping the words. Sorry, I should. Anyways, it was a beloved Millerite hymn. Okay? That hymn doesn't mention the word slavery at all, but it was actually used by the Millerites as a song of jubilee for anti-slavery purposes. For the longest time, we had no clue who wrote it. It's probably the most popular Millerite hymn, and I sing it whenever we go on our Adventist history tours and stuff that I take people on. But that song, we now know, we don't know the name of the person, but we now know it was written by a slave. Published for the first time in 1842 by Joshua V. Himes, and it was used and popularized in the Millerite camp meetings. Okay, and so it's going around all the circles at that time, and it is so popular. And the Millerites are all involved in the abolitionist movement, and so it catches on like wildfire among the abolitionists as well. Of course, many of whom are also Adventist Millerites, right? And so there are numerous other versions of this song, at least 5 other versions that have explicit anti-slavery lyrics. Okay, and one of those, and I can't remember the order I go here. I guess I don't go in all the detail here, but I'll just tell it to you. One of those versions is sung by the Hutchinson Family Singers. It's called the Old Granite State. And you probably never heard of the Hutchinson Family Singers, but they were the most famous musical group of the era. In fact, they are credited as being the ones who popularized quartet vocal singing in America. And they're credited as having the first sort of truly American sort of like folklore songs in the country. They were immensely popular. And the Old Granite State was a song, it was their very first abolitionist song. They were abolitionist singers, and they would use music to try to speak out against slavery. And they were so widely popular in America that they would always have the Old Granite State last as their sort of encore song, and people would rush the stage to hear it. This was a song that was set to the Millerite tune, and it had some Millerite lyrics in the tune. And what's amazing about that is not just that they used it for abolitionist purposes, but in the 1930s, whenever this country was trying to choose its national anthem, the Old Granite State was a contender for the national anthem. So a Millerite tune almost made it to our national anthem. Anyhow, the Millerites used the original one, "You Will See the Lord a-Comin'," which they called the Old Churchyard. They used that, as I said, as a song of jubilee. And so I want you to picture camp meetings that are happening, okay? And the way that we think about Millerism is always about like the calculations and the dates and looking at beasts and all this kind of stuff and trying to figure out when Jesus is coming. They were so much more practical than that too. They did all the dates and they did all that stuff because they wanted to know when Jesus was coming, because it pressured people to get right with God about slavery before he came, okay? That was a very important anti-slavery tactic for them. But they were also much more practical too, and so they would have fugitive slaves and preach at the Millerite camp meetings. They would have abolitionist lectures and so forth at Millerite camp meetings. And so picture a Millerite camp meeting going on. They've gone through all of the dates, all of the prophecies of Daniel, Revelation. They've done all of that, and the very last day, they want to crescendo and bring their meetings to a high point. And so what they do is they end by trying to mimic the Jubilee. They try to give a sort of an illustration of what that's like. So the last day, they don't have any of that stuff with beasts and all that kind of stuff. What they do is they have anti-slavery preaching. And so all of a sudden, everyone's there. Thousands of people are gathered at the camp meeting, and the bell rings to get everyone gathered in the great tent that holds 3,000 or 4,000 people. And then all of a sudden, they hear, out of the top of their lungs, people coming, marching into the tent. You will see the Lord a-coming, you will see the Lord a-coming, you will see the Lord a-coming in a few more days. And it's a group of black men singing at the top of their lungs, and they march up singing up to the platform this song. And when they get up there, then they have two fugitive slaves come up and preach against the evils of slavery to try to show people that Jubilee is coming, prepare and get ready. And we already know that because we've gone through all the dates. We've gone through all the biblical prophecy stuff. But now, how does that impact our lives? How do we get ready for that? And they wanted to end with that kind of a message. And so they used anti-slavery preaching, anti-slavery songs in that way in their meetings. One of my favorite meetings never happened the way it was originally intended. And that was what later became denounced as the Grand Amalgamation Festival. So a major Millerite leader named Josiah Litch, he's sort of headquartered in Philadelphia in 1842 when this is happening. Or excuse me, this is 1843, not 1842. He's there in Philadelphia, and they want to hold a Thanksgiving feast. But they want the Thanksgiving feast to be proleptic. In other words, they want it to foreshadow what is coming. Specifically, they want to try to mimic as much as they possibly can the supper of God that's promised in Revelation, right, where we'll all dine together in heaven with him. And so their plan is to go through all the highways and byways of Philadelphia to gather all of the poor black people, all the poor white people, and bring them together and give them a free feast. And they didn't stop there. In the Jim Crow North, well, I've already talked to you about that, where a white person wouldn't even want to walk down the same side of the street as a black person for fear of being ostracized. In that context, they wanted to place a black person next to a white person, and a black person, white person, all around the table, alternate the races all around the table, as a protest and as a way to show people that heaven will not be racially segregated. And if you want to be there, show it now by what you're doing. And so this was the plan, but guess what? It was found out what they were going to do. And the owner of the place, the venue that they had rented out, was called the Chinese Saloon. It was the biggest venue in Philadelphia. They refused to open up their doors to this so-called Grand Amalgamation Festival and allow this so-called sacrilege to take place. They wouldn't let it happen. The Millerites did not give up. They tried for several more weeks to have their feast happen. They couldn't find a single venue in the entire city, the so-called city of brotherly love. They wouldn't open their door to have an interracial meeting at all. And so they finally found a place where they could just target and help out one demographic. And they chose to help out poor black people rather than poor white people. And many hundreds of them were served by white Millerite leaders and others there, a free feast in what ended up being late December, like about a month late. And again, this was to try to demonstrate what heaven would be like. This is a way that they used religion as a radical protest in an era that desperately needed to hear and see the truth, right? Okay, maybe I'll end with this one. Another time there was a sort of major sort of religious meeting that impacted, this actually, it was probably the largest and most impactful thing in the entire Millerite movement when it comes to abolitionism. I have no doubt, actually. Have you heard of Charles Fitch before? Charles Fitch was one of the most important Millerite leaders in the whole movement. There's only 3 people that Ellen White actually names as seeing that they will be in heaven. There is Levi Stockman, Charles Fitch, and William Miller. That's it. Charles Fitch was a huge influence on Seventh-day Adventism, even though he dies in 1844. Perhaps you've heard the story about him baptizing people in Lake Erie, and it's very cold. It's in the early to mid-fall, and he gets cold doing that, baptizes several dozen. He gets out of the water, and he's going home, and then another group comes wanting to be baptized, and this is in October 1844. And then he baptizes all of them. gets out, starts to go home, get warmed up, and another group comes. And he baptizes all these people for hours in Lake Erie in October, and he ends up getting pneumonia, and he dies about 10 days before the Great Disappointment. Okay? And so it's tragic. This is the man who did probably the biggest sort of move to have us leave the evangelical churches, the Protestant churches, and what is known as coming out of Babylon, the come outer movement. Charles Fitch is the one really spearheading that. So this is a very important guy. Well, in 1841 and 42, he is pastoring a church in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Okay? And his congregation is an anti-slavery church, and everywhere Charles Fitch went, he made his church the center of all anti-slavery activity in that town. Okay? And this is true in Haverhill. It's true of Cleveland, where he goes later. It's been true of Boston earlier as well. And his congregation, some of his congregants are really upset with all of the continual threats where people in the South are threatening to secede the Union because the Northerners, are not protecting slavery as much as they want. And so the South, South Carolina specifically, is threatening to leave the United States. And they're just going to do that. Now, eventually this happens, right? And that's what leads to the Civil War, right? And so the abolitionists there in Charles Fitch's church, they say, well, let's see if we can call their bluff. They've been saying this for a while. I don't think they're really going to do it. And so they said, what if we crafted a petition where we asked that the North secede from the South because of slavery? What about that? And so they literally craft a petition to break apart the United States of America. Okay? They wanted to abolish our country. Not literally, I think, but it was an agitation tactic. They wanted to get attention. And so Charles Fitch has some parishioners there. You see this man on the left, that his name was Benjamin Emerson II. He's the one who drafts this petition. He's called the father of the Haverhill petition because that petition ended up changing our entire nation's history. What happens is they write it, and the next day is what they called the Sabbath, the Sunday, and Charles Fitch is preaching. He's in the middle of a Millerite revival series, and after he's done, they will hold communion, okay? And so they have that done on the altar. They consider that a sacred space in their church, and as soon as they hold communion, they have the communion altar cleared, and then Charles Fitch will place that petition to abolish the country on the altar, and he will invite all of his people in his congregation to come up and sign that petition. It was a sacred ritual for them. Now, why is that the case? Just like today, petition is a synonym for what other word? Request, yeah, but specifically think about religion. It's a synonym for the word prayer. Okay? Bring your prayers and petitions to the Lord, right? We use that in some sense that way today. And they viewed it that way as well. And so Fitch and his congregation are wanting to send a prayer to their nation, but most importantly to their God, to have this injustice eradicated as soon as possible. And so what they will do after that is they will take that petition and try to get it signed around town. Well, within a couple of hours, they found out that it was really a bad idea because people were so angry about that petition, they were trying to destroy it. And so what they ended up having to do is they end up hiding that petition, and they actually will tell people, if you want to sign it, then we'll make an appointment and you can come under the cover of darkness by stealth and not we won't tell anybody where it's at. And so they tried that for another day, maybe two. And by that time, they realized that if they wanted their petition to literally survive, they had to just get rid of it. So they sent it to John Quincy Adams. Does that name ring a bell? Yeah. Ex-president of the United States. He was an amazing person, in my opinion, because after he served as president of the United States, he did not give up, and he went and he served for decades in the House of Representatives as a representative for Massachusetts. And he was one of the only two presidents of our country up until Lincoln who never owned slaves. The other person was his father, John Adams. Those are the only two presidents that never owned slaves before the Civil War. And so Adams, both of them, were against slavery, and they were opposed to it. And John Quincy Adams used his position in Congress to try to get rid of slavery or undermine it as much as he could. There was one problem, though. Congress passed something called a gag law in 1836 that prevented the discussion of slavery in Congress. They couldn't even do it. So petitions by abolitionists, they would just immediately table them or throw them away. That goes against an actual constitutional right we have, the right to petition. But they didn't care. They just violated the Constitution that way by passing a gag law that was in place from 1836 to 1844, and Adams was on a warpath to get rid of that gag law. And so Charles Fitch's church, they send John Quincy Adams that petition, and Adams has the guts to present that petition in Congress. And when he did, friends, things hit the fan. People were stunned initially, and then immediately they are calling for the petition to be burned in the house. Some people are calling for Adams to be hanged. Some people are calling for him to be tried for treason. And they actually end up passing a censure resolution, and they put Adams on trial in the House of Representatives for treason. But Adams voted with his antagonists to put himself on trial. And I love this about Adams. Do you know why he did that? It's because Adams, as an ex-son of a president, one of the founding fathers basically, the most distinguished person in the House of Representatives, the most distinguished man in Congress, he knew that if he was put on so-called trial, he would have the right to defend himself until he decided to be done. He would hold the floor in perpetuity, day after day, until he decided that his time was done and he had had his peace. So Adams says, go ahead, see if you can expel me. See if you can do this to me or whatever, and let's have this fight on. And so for almost 2 weeks, Adams will sit there and berate everyone in Congress about the evils of slavery in every kind of form or fashion. He talks about the rights of black sailors being violated in the South, because black sailors from the North are going there and they're getting thrown in prison or enslaved or whatever. He goes into that detail. He goes into the gag law. He goes into other aspects of slavery. For 2 weeks almost, it's a little over a week and a half. And everyone has to sit there and listen to this. That was a huge deal sparked by a Millerite petition. And it wasn't just that. Abolitionists are watching. And William Lloyd Garrison, who's one of the most foremost leaders of the abolitionist movement, he is so impressed that he will push this forward, this idea of disunionism, breaking apart the Union, having the North secede from the South. And in 1844, the American Anti-Slavery Society will make that their official motto: no union with slaveholders. An idea that originated with Millerites and a Millerite revival in Charles Fitch's church. And it wasn't just that, but it led to a whole wave of petitioning because the Adventists were the first one to do it, and then people said, this is so effective, we've got to keep doing it. And they do it all the way until slavery is abolished in 1865. So in this one act alone, the Millerite movement permanently shaped and transformed the abolitionist movement. It was never the same again. And they also permanently shaped America, because all historians out there will tell you that the Haverhill petition and Adams' trial led to the end of the gag laws in 1844, which was the greatest victory over slavery up to that time in history. So my friends, the pioneers of our church were not silent. They recognized that silence was a sin. And they also recognized that if Jesus is coming soon, we've got to prepare our hearts, our minds, and we've got to live that faith. God blessed their efforts. We have not known this for so long. We have not known this history. We lost sight of our own history. But God used the beginnings of our movement to change the world. He used the beginnings of our movement to help abolish slavery. What's tragic to me is that we lost our way at some point. Because the 20th century especially, our history in the church is by and large a history of racism when it comes to these issues. We fell far from that original tree. And we have a lot of errors in our past. Really horrible things that have happened. But I do hope that there's something about our past that can help us to think about the Bible and what God is calling us to do in a new, fresh way, so that we can rise up and maybe reclaim that. We have a unique problem, because most people in America, they have a legacy of slavery. Adventism has a legacy of anti-slavery, and yet we ended up in the same place. But whereas other people are trying to grapple with their legacies of slavery, to talk about all the problems that they were doing and how much they messed up, to try to come up with a more positive way forward, we can look at our anti-slavery positive beginnings and try to reclaim that so that we don't continue to participate in the problems that are occurring right now. So, a lot of history. I hope you get the spiritual message and point. And we got a lot more to share with you. So we'll leave it with that. I don't know if you guys have any questions. You can certainly ask them later, but should I close with prayer? Yes. Would you like to pray? Or, I mean, yeah.
No, you can close.
Okay. Okay, let's bow our heads. Gracious Lord, we want to thank you for your mercy and your grace. We're humans, we're frail, we make mistakes, and we have done so from the dawn of time. And for whatever reason, you think we're worth saving, you think that we're worth, maybe can change and do things right. And Lord, we have collectively done things right in the past, and there are really wonderful things to dwell on and think about, even though there are also trials and struggles too. And Lord, we're living in an era where we need people to stand up just like they have done in the past in the face of injustice, to not be silent, but to call out all the problems that are happening and to do whatever we can to try to stop it. People's lives are being ruined and wrecked and hurt. People are dying. It's got to end. And I just pray that those of us gathered here can be a part of the solution and help stop the problem. And so I pray for courage for us. I pray for us to be faithful. I pray that we can not just listen to your truth in Scripture as if it's just a bunch of platitudes. Help it to be real in our lives. Help it to transform us and change us, to make us your hands and feet like you want us to be. Help us to care for the least of these, especially when it's hard. May we not give up. May you give us courage and strength. And may you just give us your grace every day. Thank you, Lord. Amen.
Thank you so much. How many of you have been blessed? Amen. You know, this month is the Black History Month, and what an amazing beginning to understand the contribution of the gospel and our pioneers in this nation. So that was very interesting, huh, Carl? So we will see you tomorrow. Dr. Kevin Burton will be tomorrow preaching and also doing a presentation in the afternoon after we have a light lunch that we've been preparing for you. So until then, God bless you and thank you so much for coming.